Amidst the immense mountain ranges of British Columbia, 15-year-old Will Johnson felt like he was on a whole other planet. Then, an unexpected shout caught his attention. Glancing around, he witnessed an avalanche cascading down a nearby peak. His initial awe turned to dread as the guy bolted and it hit Will. His countdown to survival had just begun. Now, what are the odds of making it out alive under an avalanche? What's deadlier, suffocating or the biting cold? And why do attempts to conquer mountain peaks often end in tragedy? In the mountain regions of Canada, even kids get schooled in avalanche safety. At the prestigious Strathcona Tweedsmuir School, or STS, peak expeditions are considered a special ceremony among students. Little did they know, one would turn into the country's most haunting mountain tragedy. A secret held for 12 years until one victim found the courage to speak out. On January 31st, 2003, 13 STS students embarked on an initiation hike. Among them, there was 15-year-old Will Johnson. The school bus dropped them at the center of Glacier National Park in British Columbia. Not so long ago, 7 experienced skiers had lost their lives there. However, the STS group leader, Mr. Nick, personally assessed the avalanche risk on their route, rating it at a 2 out of 5, confident that no harm would befall their group. On the first day, accompanied by 3 adults, the group ventured onto the mountainside, learning the basics of avalanche safety. By evening, they reached their overnight spot, where Will and the other teens struggled to sleep in anticipation of adventure. Little did they know, it would be their last peaceful night. On the morning of February 1st, the sky was clouded, but the temperature hovered around freezing, 0 degrees. The plan was to ascend Balu Pass and ski down from there. Despite the anticipated 3-hour climb and challenging terrain, Will reveled in the breathtaking views. Suddenly, a cry rang out. He strained to see through the low clouds, and then the astonishing sight unfolded. An avalanche on the neighboring peak. Simultaneously, at exactly 11:45 a.m., 2 experienced climbers, Abby Watkins and Rich Marshall, heard a loud crack ahead of the student group. They realized with horror that an unstoppable wall of snow hurtled toward the students. Despite their desperate shouts to warn them, it was futile. Helplessly, they watched as the avalanche swallowed the kids alive. Just moments before, Will Johnson noticed their guide frantically throwing away his backpack and skis. It dawned on him, the avalanche wasn't somewhere out there. It was barreling straight toward them. Seconds later, a massive icy wall buried the students, stretching 1,000 meters in length and 800 meters in width. 5,000 tons of snow crashed into the valley floor at a speed of 150 kilometers per hour, obliterating everything in its path. In the deepest part, the snowpack reached 5 meters, and beneath it lay the school group. Will remained conscious, feeling the fluffy snow that buried him swiftly turning into concrete. He couldn't move his fingers, and his chest had nowhere to expand, barely breathing. He hoped someone in the group had escaped the avalanche and would find him soon. Yet all he could think about was the painful struggle for breath, his mouth packed with snow, and the cold gradually turning his body into ice. Meanwhile, despite the risk of triggering another avalanche, Abby Watkins and Rich Marshall descended to the disaster site. They managed to uncover Mr. Nick, who was least buried and, what's even more important, had a satellite phone. Rescue was summoned straight away. However, the guides knew every second mattered. Within 30 minutes, survival chances under the snow dropped to 50%, and in 45 minutes, they plummeted below 30. Immediately, the 3 adults began searching for the trapped students. Will Johnson came to his senses on the surface, brushing off snow and zipping up his jacket. It took him a few minutes to recall how he got caught in the avalanche, froze alive, struggled for breath in a snow tomb, and eventually blacked out. Looking around, he realized the extent of the catastrophe. They rescued him right after Mr. Nick, but the rest were still under the snow. Despite the cold and injuries, Will immediately dove into digging out his buddies. Another saved student joined him, and they dug through the snow until their lungs burned and their hands went numb. Suddenly, Will was called to help another rescued unconscious guy, tasked with giving him CPR. Exhausted but relentless, he mechanically pressed and breathed like a robot. In less than an hour, 7 helicopters and 48 rescuers with dogs arrived at the disaster site. One of them asked Will to stop the chest compressions, and at that moment, the guy realized for the first time that not everyone survived. He shockingly glanced around and saw a long probe marking where they found a person under the snow. But behind it, there was another, then another, and another. Eventually, they evacuated Will Johnson and took him to a hotel where only 6 terrified students greeted him. Soon, it became known that the other 7 kids had passed away. Those who survived refused to talk about the tragedy for years until Will finally mustered the courage to share this horrifying story with the world. It didn't kill him on the spot, yet wrecked his life with PTSD, alcoholism, and nightmares. Still, Will Johnson is far from the only one burdened with such a weight. In May of 1986, students from the Oregon Episcopal School planned a mountain trip. 15 teens gathered to conquer the local 3,000er, Mount Hood, near Portland. So, along with the school chaplain and group leader, Thomas Gorman, they set out on a hike at 3 a.m. on May 12th. The school dean, Marion Horwell, 2 professional guides, Ralph Summers and Dee Duniak, and the mother of one of the students, Sharon Spray, also joined them. So, overall, the group consisted of 20 people. Though that day's forecast included a strong and prolonged storm, Chaplain Gorman was convinced the group would finish the hike before the weather worsened. Thus, they started their 10-kilometer journey through deep snow in complete darkness. As dawn broke, the weather began to deteriorate, and concern within the group grew. At some point, student Hillary Spray and her mother, Sharon, announced they were heading back down. The rest of the group tried to persuade the girl to continue, yet she felt so bad that her mother insisted on returning. They became the first to win the ascent, which, just a few hours later, turned into one of the deadliest mountaineering catastrophes in North American history. When the group reached the cabin at almost 2,200 meters, 4 more students and guide Dee Duniak decided to descend as well. The remaining 13 people continued the hike. However, within a few hours, the weather completely worsened. Guide Ralph Summers suggested turning back, but Chaplain Gorman insisted on continuing. Battling strong wind and cold, the group almost reached the summit when conditions became unbearable. Summers finally convinced the leader to turn back. Unfortunately, it was too late. A powerful storm enveloped the mountain. Due to heavy snow, visibility dropped to 6 meters. The sky couldn't be distinguished from the ground, causing dizziness in many students. But the first serious problem arose when the youngest in the group, 15-year-old Patrick McGinnis, froze to the point where he fell and could no longer move. Graduate and seasoned climber, Susan McClave, ordered to put the guy in the only sleeping bag in the group, then took off her jacket and boots and crawled in with him. It was the most effective way to warm up in the mountains, and it indeed saved the guy. Still, the group wasted too much time on this. Afterward, the students kept going, relying on a poorly collaborated compass that led them to their demise. The wind speed reached 166 kilometers per hour, equivalent to a Category 2 hurricane. Visibility was almost zero, and the group had to traverse a glacier with large crevices. Summers decided it was too dangerous, so, at 2,500 meters, he began digging a shelter in the snow. However, he managed to dig a cave for only 6 people, and there were 13 of them. Soon, the students in the improvised shelter began running out of oxygen, and the warmth from their bodies melted the snow, forming a puddle on the floor. The remaining 7 people stayed in the open until it was their turn to take their place in the cave. The storm didn't let up, and the shelter entrance was getting increasingly buried in snow. So, Summers and the student, Molly Shula, went in search of help. Understanding that it was their only chance of survival, they disappeared into the blizzard, hoping to assist others, but went in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, local rescuers realized that the group hadn't returned on time. Despite the weather being one of the worst they had ever seen, they set out on the search, risking their own lives. Despite all efforts, they couldn't find the students at night. They were almost entirely buried in their snow cave and suffered from a significant lack of oxygen. At some point, Allison Litzenberger, in a panic, pushed through the nearly covered exit and ran into the unknown. 2 more, Aaron O'Leary and Eric Sandvik, followed her. The rest remained in the cave, frozen and desperate. When the weather finally improved in the morning, rescuers resumed their work and within a few hours noticed 3 human figures on the mountainside. No one knew if they were alive, but everyone hoped for a miracle. And it happened, though where it was unexpected, because Ralph Summers and Molly Shula descended from the mountains. They were the ones who rushed for help during the night. Despite exhaustion, the guide immediately joined the search party, but hours passed, and they couldn't find anyone else. In the evening, rescuers were preparing to return when suddenly, one of them found something hard under the snow. Everyone began digging, and out of the blue, moans were heard from under the snow pile. Those were the semi-conscious Britton Clark and Giles Thompson. Their body temperature was barely above 23 degrees Celsius, yet they managed to survive. However, the other 7 students found in the snow cave and on the adjacent hill didn't make it. The 2 school teachers also perished, so the deadly blizzard claimed 9 lives in total. Even though teenagers were the victims of these tragedies, the mountains remain equally perilous for climbers of any age and skill, especially if they decide to conquer Denali, the highest peak in North America, which was the goal of 12 climbers in 1967. They formed a team by chance because Jerry Lewis, Paul Schlichter, and Howard Snyder were left without a 4th member at the last minute. So, the trio joined Joe Wilcox's expedition. The crew consisted of 9 people, including the leader, a young but experienced mountaineer. Mount Denali, the peak they aim to conquer, stands at 6,190 meters above sea level with a steep vertical relief. The ascent from its base to the summit is one of the longest in the world, 6,000 meters. While on Everest, for that matter, it's just 4,700 meters. Moreover, Denali is located in the perfect storm zone and is one of the coldest places on Earth. Experienced meteorologist Chris Tomer assures that it's the toughest mountain on the whole globe, mainly due to weather conditions. Before Wilcox's expedition, only 213 people had reached Denali's summit. Yet this didn't deter the young climbers who set out for the top on July 15th. Nonetheless, troubles accompanied the group from the very beginning. First, they got hit by rain, soaking their gear. Then, a fire broke out in one of the tents, destroying more equipment. Besides, not everyone in the group got along well, eventually leading to 3 members from Snyder's group, together with Joe Wilcox, heading for the summit separately from the rest. And may I just point out that they were the most experienced among the dozen climbers on that fateful journey. Thus, it's no surprise that 4 of them easily conquered Denali and returned to the camp. Just 2 hours after the ascent, the other 8 people were preparing for their climb the next day. Although a storm raged at night, the sky cleared by morning. The 4 who had already summited, along with another climber, descended to a lower camp. When they looked up at the rest of the group, they were surprised. Instead of taking advantage of the good weather and heading for the summit, they were tidying up the camp. In the end, it was this delay that decided their fate. Jerry Clark, who had previous Antarctic experience, led the group, setting out only around 3 p.m. They hoped to cover the entire route quickly, so they took minimal gear and food. However, in the evening, Clark radioed local rangers, reporting that the group had lost its way to the summit due to thick fog. They didn't ask for help, but said they'd spend the night in the mountains. The next morning, the climber calmly reported that they had reached the summit and started descending. Everything seemed fine. The next scheduled radio session was in the evening, but it never happened. Why? The thing is that one of the most powerful storms in history hit Denali. The wind reached 483 kilometers per hour, and the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The storm raged for 5 days. Wilcox, Snyder, and Schlichter tried to search for their companions, but the storm proved too powerful. When it finally subsided, the search began. However, after 5 days, they only found an empty camp. One of the climbers' bodies, unrecognizable due to the storm, was discovered later. The rest disappeared without a trace. Denali became the site of death and burial for 7 people from Wilcox's expedition. No one will ever know exactly what happened to them, but their last moments most certainly were horrific. In such a storm, the group likely got disoriented almost instantly, with the fierce wind tearing off their gloves and the biting cold freezing their fingers and faces. It seems the group panicked and split up, freezing to death alone in complete darkness. Wilcox, Snyder, and Schlichter were accused of leaving the less experienced climbers, though later on, all experts concluded that no one, even the most trained warrior, would have survived at the summit during such a storm. And this is no metaphor, as the deadliest mountaineering story in human history is essentially about the military. At 10 in the morning on January 27, 1902, on Hakoda Mountain, Japanese Army rescuers found an officer frozen halfway to death. He could barely speak, but kept repeating Captain Shencheng's name. A few days earlier, he led 210 soldiers into the mountains, and they all vanished. That winter, Japanese forces were conducting training, gearing up for a potential war with Tsarist Russia. 38 soldiers of the 31st Infantry Company were supposed to figure out the best snow march techniques and test what gear was necessary in such cold conditions. Captain Fukushima Tazo led them, having prepared thoroughly for the expedition, arranging for a guide and local support. Meanwhile, the 5th Infantry Company, with 210 soldiers, was tasked with checking if delivering cargo by sleds was feasible, in case they blew up the railroad. Major Yamaguchi, who had partial training, led this group and even refused a local guide, as, in his opinion, the guy just wanted to make some money on rather easy and trivial things. The toughest part of the soldiers' journey spanned 20 kilometers, crossing Otoke Peak at 1,585 meters. Deep snow covered the path in winter, and the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. So, on January 21st, Captain Fukushima's group set out for training. 2 days later, Major Yamaguchi led his soldiers out with 1,200 tons of supplies. Almost immediately, the weather went south, and a blizzard started. The 38th Infantry Company, who had been on the road for several days, was terribly fatigued. Captain Fukushima ordered them to dig a hole in the snow, put branches at the bottom, and shelter from the storm, sending a guide to find the way or some cover. However, the 5th Infantry Company continued their journey despite the locals' warning, and the Army doctor's advice to wait out the storm. You see, Major Yamaguchi wanted to reach the next point on the route, Tashiro Shinyu, where there were hot springs to warm up. However, the snowstorm intensified, and the soldiers pulling sleds fell significantly behind the rest of the group. Major Yamaguchi ordered them to abandon the cargo and carry the supplies by hand. Walking became even more challenging for the soldiers. The worst part was they didn't know where to go, as they got disoriented in the darkness and snowstorm. In the evening, the major admitted that the unit wouldn't make it into the hot springs and ordered to set up camp in the snow. As none of the soldiers had such experience, they didn't lay branches at the bottom of the trenches. When the 40 men descended into the snow pits, water quickly appeared at the bottom, soaking their feet. Eventually, Yamaguchi ordered to put down the flooring, causing the next disaster. Chopping branches, soldiers had to take off their gloves. So, at minus 20, they frostbit their fingers. Commanders realized their situation was much worse than they thought, and the only way out was to keep moving. In reality, the unit was only about 1,500 meters from Tashiro, but they took the wrong path and got lost. The cold, heavy snow, darkness, and uncertainty drained the people. The major ordered the soldiers to climb a high hill, but some couldn't manage. Exhausted, people fell and froze to death. And reaching the hill's top, soldiers had nowhere to hide from the storm wind blowing at over 32 meters per second. They couldn't dig trenches, barely moved, and all their food turned into chunks of ice. In desperation, the military arranged themselves in circles, putting the weakest at the center. People hoped to warm up. Instead, a third of them froze to death. Those who made it through kept wandering the mountains, tumbling down the slopes, or jumping off cliffs. Major Yamaguchi lost consciousness after 2 days and never got up again. Dozens of soldiers, still on their feet and searching for salvation, rallied under Captain Shingcheng's command. He split the personnel into 2 groups, one going left, the other right. The captain chose the right path but couldn't reach the nearest settlement. On the morning of January 27th, rescuers found Shengcheng and a few soldiers still alive. The captain's body was so frozen that giving him a shot was impossible. A similar fate befell most of the 5th Infantry Company. Their route was literally paved with frozen bodies. Only 11 soldiers survived, and 8 of them had to undergo amputations. The rest of the 199 from the 5th Infantry Company perished. And on the other hand, the whole 31st Infantry Company arrived at their destination on the morning of January 29th. You know, mountains are just mountains after all. And snow is just snow. They're not cruel, not out to kill you, so actually, they aren't to blame. Not only seasoned climbers believe in that, but also the survivors of nature's fury, like Will Johnson. Even though part of his soul died under those snows with his comrades, he understands it's a tragic accident with no one to blame. What's your take on this? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more survival stories.